Welcome back, everyone, to Pencils and Lipstick. I'm excited to have Jennifer Hilt with me on the show. We are going to talk about her nonfiction this time. We might have her back for fiction very soon. But Jennifer, thank you for coming on to talk to me today about tropes.
Oh,
I'm very
yeah. Well,
excited.
thank you for having me. It's always fun to talk tropes.
Yes, I mean, I think you are the most excited person about tropes that I've ever met because some of us find it really frustrating, but you break it down. But before we go into that, will you tell everyone a little bit about yourself, your writing life, and all that?
Sure. I've been writing for a super long time. I started as a kid, and I always loved language and storytelling. And I did a bunch of different things along the way, but I was always working. I was always a super big reader too, and I ended up doing degrees in linguistics and English. Uh, Always writing, writing, writing. Had family that slowed me down with some things. Um, and then just did a lot of indie publishing for a bunch of different genres of romance, but I love fantasy. So I kept that stuff out all under my own name. And I'm looking forward to getting back to that when I wrap up these trope books. Other than that, yes, I love to talk tropes, and it's really fun to talk to people other than my poor family who have been like, I've ruined any kind of viewing experience for them ever.
Yes. Yes, that is so true. My family now like
Yeah.
doesn't want to watch movies with me
Yeah.
because I can't keep my mouth shut. I'm like, of course. Of course it's Iron Man. It has to
Yeah.
be because and they're like,
Right.
shut up.
Yeah.
Like,
My
it's the
husband once came
obvious choice.
upstairs. My husband once came upstairs once. I'm not a huge Star Wars person. He was watching one of those offshoot ones, and he comes upstairs and he's like, at the end of the whole series, he's like, he leans against the door, he sighs, he goes, ah, it was all secret baby.
That's so funny. And
I was
he's
like
not a
laughing
writer
so
at
hard.
all.
I'm like, oops, sorry.
It all comes back to that one.
Yeah.
It's funny though, because we'll get into what that means in case nobody knows, but like, it's funny how simple our minds are and how
Mhm.
complicated we can make a simple idea. Like,
Yes. Yes.
I
And I
think
don't
that's
know
really
who.
fascinating.
It is. And I don't know which, genius person says this, but I refer to it a lot, of the idea of complex characters, simple plot. And I
Hmm.
really believe like that's in successful storytelling. It's
Right.
really not these over, even if it's like a thriller and all these kind of things, it's really the complex characters. And there's like plot twists and stuff. But
Yeah.
it's like, if when you as soon as you like lose your audience, then it's over. They
Yes.
drift off, and there's so many other things we can do and things
Yes.
like.
Yes. And what's interesting is a lot of times we think it's the plot. Like
Mhm.
it needs the
Right.
plot. It needs more
Right.
plot, which it does need a plot, you know.
Right.
There's
Right.
there's
But
two different
right.
kind of so go ahead. What were you gonna say?
Yes, and I think it's just the kind of part that when it's done well, it looks so seamless, is
Mm,
really linking the plot and the character by the conflict
right.
that this character driven makes the plot so good. Like on
Yes.
some things I really like, I'm like, oh, of course that's why it works. But
Yes.
it's like
Yes.
all caught up in watching it, and so then
Of
it,
course. I
yeah,
mean, and we are analyzers of stories more than watchers.
yes,
But
yes,
yeah, I mean, storytelling is complex because there are so many things that go into it,
mhm,
right?
mhm,
But what I really loved about your books is that it really broke down the idea of tropes because we
good, good,
hear this word thrown
yes,
around a lot. And
yes, mhm,
I really enjoyed the fact that you were like honest. You were like, I don't, in the beginning, I was just like, I don't even know.
right,
Like, I don't
yeah,
want to touch this because that's how I was. So,
right,
could
right.
you break down like what a trope is first for anyone
Sure.
who doesn't know? And then we'll get into why it's not just for romance.
Yes, of course, of course. Um, well, for me, I discovered that a trope at its most like basic form, it is just a storytelling building block.
Mm,
And now I feel like, oh, that I don't know why it took me like so long to figure that out, but it did. I think what explains it, and what gets missed in our like discussion of it, is that that's why tropes have been around for so long, because it's like a common storytelling block, which is also related to relationships. Like all tropes some way are about relationships, either like
right.
a person or a relationship, like one, kind of like an object, or they're in a relationship. And so that's what I think makes them so popular, not only for decades, but like centuries, like
Yeah.
going back to like fairy tales and stuff like that.
Right.
So I think that a trope is just a storytelling idea that like we can use so that the reader's like, oh, I know what they're talking about. It's not like we need to go into, lose them with all these pages of description right away. We introduce the idea of what the trope is, and then we can take and develop that to how it fits our world and our characters. So they're
Right.
like, oh, I know she's talking about this, but what about that is interests me is XYZ,
Yeah.
So
Yes.
yeah.
So why do you think some of us want to avoid like the idea of tropes?
Yeah. No, I think that's a really good question. That was in the beginning. I was thinking of that too, because I'm like, wait, everybody's so resistant about it, and me too. I was like, oh, I don't. But when I was working with people and helping them plot their stories, it was like how we were talking about it, but then there's all this like pushback of worry, like, but I want to be a good writer and a creative writer, and tropes are cliches. And I really felt like the more I studied it, that tropes aren't cliches. Cliches are like an idea, like a poorly developed trope, or there's
Mm,
just not enough. Like you just started with the idea, but then you never carried on to make it specific to your world and develop it in details. You just kind of dropped it in there and like, okay, the writer or the reader or the audience or whoever, we'll let them figure it out. And that's how come we get, I think,
okay.
cliches. Whereas if we
Okay.
take the time to like develop that idea and make it really work in our world, then it's like, oh, then it's a character. It's a fully fleshed character that people can root for or against, or, you
Yeah.
know, have a relationship with.
I think that's a perfect explanation because when you go into like I love how you take movies and you break them down with
Uh-huh.
all the tropes that are in there.
Yeah.
Then you that was what opened my eyes because I was like, "Oh my gosh, we do this naturally."
Yes,
Like,
exactly. Yeah.
like so
Right.
you might as well just accept it that
Yeah.
it is a building block. It's just
Right.
I mean, especially journey and,
Yeah.
violence and all that, like,
Right.
of course it's gonna be in there.
Right. And I think I think the thing that's different, it's not that tropes are like new. It's
Mm,
just that the way we talk about them is really new. You know,
okay.
because we weren't having these conversations like 5 years ago. I think the movie industry's been having them much longer.
Yeah.
Um, but like now it's like everywhere. Like I see them in like BuzzFeed articles like, oh, which movies are your favorite enemies to lovers? I just saw a
Right.
whole article about that talked about tropes in like the just regular old, news. And I was like, wow, like, so we're expecting people to know about this all over. So of course, writers, I think,
Interesting.
feel like, oh my gosh, I don't know about this thing. But I really wanted people to feel like, yeah, you do. You know the thing.
Yeah.
Don't
Yeah.
worry, and just make the thing work for you, as opposed to feel like, oh, I have to stick tropes in my story. You probably already have them in there. Just
Yes.
dig down to make sure that the reader gets, oh, there's a best friend in here and there's a boy next door or whatever, so
Right. Right.
idea.
And I think maybe it's the social media, like the hashtag
Mm,
enemies to
mhm.
lovers, or hashtag secret
Yes,
baby or whatever. And so that way you target that reader, right? So you have
yes,
to make
right,
sure that you're getting the correct reader. That's
right.
interesting that BuzzFeed would be like, of
Yeah,
course it would be that those writers who are like, come on,
right.
writers, figure this
Yeah.
out.
Yeah, I think it's, they're younger, they're very savvy
Yeah.
about like social media stuff, but I just thought that was really interesting. And I've noticed like Netflix now also will have tropes. Like, oh, you
Yes.
like these, so you should and they'll like list some of the tropes kind of down in the corner. And I was like, oh, that's it. It's really interesting.
Right.
But
Yeah, I mean
romance
this
writers,
go ahead.
oh, I was just gonna say, but romance writers have been like savvy about tropes for so long because, they'll be like, I love Secret Baby, or I love twin
Mhm.
stories, or, you know, they've been really good about saying what they have liked and telling us that. And then it's just kind of like I feel like the other genres are catching up to that now.
Right. Whether they're like just putting a name on that or just accepting what it is, it's like
Right, right.
again, it's just a building block. And I
Yeah,
think
right.
what's interesting though, the way that you look at tropes, and in order to especially not make them cliches, is sometimes people talk about like, oh, I hate Secret Baby. But the
Mhm.
fact of the matter is like Secret Baby is just like the general idea and people can
Right.
twist it. And you
Yes.
might actually like Secret Baby in
Yeah.
many things because it's a
Yes.
new way of doing it, right? Like
Right.
that's
Yeah.
very interesting.
Yeah, I mean, like, a lot of times people are like, "Oh, yeah, I don't like Secret Baby." Um, because I think they think of Secret Baby as like specifically a very kind of romance cliche, like from soap operas, if you're old enough to have watched those, or like different kind of those serial things. But I read a lot of mystery too, and there's always a secret baby in those, because it's just like, oh, they're grown up, but then you find out, oh, this is like so and so's, child that we never knew, they never knew. That is a secret baby trope. I mean,
Right.
it's
Yes.
and it's almost always as a misdirection, red herring, and mystery. Like I hardly ever read a like one that there isn't in there, because it's a great way to kind of shift things for the reader and lead them astray.
Yeah, yeah, especially if you have a reason, like
Yeah, right. Of
a
course.
background why they're having it.
Yes,
But
yes.
what I find is interesting is like I have really thought hard this last year of like what kind of writer I'm, because I find plotting very difficult.
Mhm.
And I've been studying it. So I don't know about you, but I think I come up with the character first, and I come
Yes.
up with a
Mhm.
certain scene first of like, ooh,
Yes.
I want this scene in there, whether
Yes.
it's kind of
Mhm.
how they finally get together or like the conflict,
Mhm.
or the climax
Right.
or whatever. And then I have to build a story around it. Right?
Exactly. Yes.
And you're like, okay, now I have to start the book and I have to figure it
Right.
out. And
Right.
I have written a couple books in the quote unquote discovery way, where you're just
Mhm.
writing in it, you end up tossing a lot because you're really
Yes.
just discovering the plot and
Right.
what can you do and all this. But I've been trying to figure out a way to like plot it.
Right.
And so when I heard you talk last week, I was like, I need that book, because I bet you anything it will at least get my brain moving in the right direction rather than the frustrated direction of like, but why are they there? Like I
Right.
want them here. Well, why? Like, and how can I get them there?
Yeah.
Um, and so what I love about especially this first one, so this is the first one, the trope thesaurus, or um
Mhm.
I'm trying to fit it to the camera. That's not right. Um, and so this really is a general idea of how to use tropes and where they
Right.
are.
Mhm.
And it was like a light bulb. And I don't know why. You should see all the books. I mean, I have a stack right here on craft. Not to say that you don't need craft, because you still have to build
Of course. Yeah.
your characters. With this book, I was like, oh, secret babies everywhere. Oh, look at that's true. Oh, look at that. I don't know why, Jennifer. I do not know why, but I don't think that I'm alone. So when you're like struggling with plotting and what's
Mhm.
gonna come up, I think this is a really nice resource to get to and say, okay, I need this person, but why would they do it? Could it be secret baby, unrequited
Mhm.
love? Could it
Right.
be? So did you find that interesting as you were studying this, or did you already know this?
Oh, no, 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 no. I found it very interesting because I think my process is very similar to yours. I'm mostly interested in character. I
Mm,
would always struggle with plot. A lot of times, I hear dialogue
yeah,
in my head, and it's like, oh, but and I always had thought, well, I'm just unfortunately like 50 years too late because the playwright business is dead, you know. So these people like have to be doing things. So then I have to like come up with stuff for them to do. So all this is like, been a really long process for me to figure out, and that like, oh yeah, like tropes can help me with that. Because
yes,
because yeah, you got to get like I especially with the middle, I find is like, and I think that's for a lot of people too. Like you can start out strong, but if you just don't have the really good conflict, then it just kind of, And so I was like, oh, okay. So tropes are a way that can get us through the middle to the end,
right,
by having all these things. So no, for me, I am, if left to my own devices, I am a discovery writer, and the same way, like you said, it's a lot of thrown out work. Like it was
yes,
taking
it's
forever to
frustrating.
get anything done. And it's interesting, but it's also hard to like, it takes you forever, it's hard to meet deadlines. And so it's like, okay, I need to get more organized about this. And it actually helped to be plotting with other people, because I can somehow make up stories easier for other people, because I guess I don't have to write it then. So
Yeah,
it's like, oh, okay, I can write this
so
whole
true.
story. And then I like come up with this plot with somebody, and like, oh, great. Well, okay, you go off and write that. So I've already basically told that story in my mind. So I don't have to do it now. That's great.
Yeah, somebody come over
So
here and fix my story. What is going on?
exactly. But like when it's your own work, you're like, oh, okay, so what am I gonna do?
So what am I gonna do? Yeah, and I think that's one of our issues too as creatives. We want to do something new. And
Right.
so a lot of times we can fool ourselves into thinking that's been done before. I got to do something new when
Mhm.
realistically, it's all been done before.
Mhm.
We just need to find a twist. And what you can do
Yeah.
is find a trope, put it together, or twist them. But I
Mhm.
keep saying twist it. So, like, I'm a pretty linear thinker. So, how, for anyone else, how would you twist a trope? So, like, let's take a
Yeah.
trope and see if you can figure out a way that you see. I don't know. You can choose
Well, the
what you've
I
seen.
don't when we had talked last week, I didn't know if you heard the one example that I thought that's kind of easy just to start out with because everybody knows about it is the idea of the virgin trope and
Okay.
the movie The 40-Year-Old Virgin, I think was a great
Right.
twist on that because I was just like, how could you, I'd think like, how could you do another twist on the
Yeah.
virgin trope? You'd think like, oh my gosh, it's been done everywhere and everything. And then they actually super smart though. So like
Yeah.
come up with a new way to do it. Oh, it's a guy, and it's actually about an emotional connection. It's not just about sexual activity, and
Right.
he really explores that. And so I was like, that's why I was like, oh, Hollywood has been like really quick to figure out, I think, how to use tropes to get audiences more so than authors who maybe because we feel like we have more time with pages as opposed to like an hour and a
They've
half.
got a deadline.
Yeah,
Well, it might be there's more than one writer usually too. So the I
that's
think
true.
like you've said,
Yes.
you help writers plot
Yeah.
out. It's
Right.
that brainstorming where you're like,
Mhm.
well, okay, yes, but whose baby is it? As the
Right,
if they're that.
right, right. Yeah, I
They're the
think
baby they
so.
gave up. Yeah.
Yeah. Because a lot of times, even with like helping somebody, it's just having this like energy exchange that
Mm,
people feel more like free to like, oh, they'll, I'd suggest something and they're like, yeah, but it triggers some other thing. And that's
exactly.
really the really helpful thing because that's really their idea. They're invested in it. It's their idea. It's how they saw the character, but they just kind of had to dig down a little
Mm,
more.
right.
So anyway, that was just kind of, I guess, the easiest way of, I think, of how to twist a trope is to just kind of think of that movie in terms of everybody knows what it is, but yet it's like a different way of presenting it of like, oh, well, now I'm kind of interested. What is that? You know?
Hmm.
Um,
Yes.
but it's used in, I mean, it can be used in all different tropes can be used in all different ways, like we talk about in all different genres. It's just kind of how you want to twist it.
Okay, so as you talk about genres, you have one book that's sort of the overarching,
Mhm.
how we're going to use tropes. But now you've come out with books as like the trope thesaurus for romance, the trope thesaurus for horror, and then is sci-fi out yet?
So fantasy sci-fi is the one I'm doing the Kickstarter for now.
Okay, okay.
Yeah.
So
Mhm.
we'll have links to that as well. So what what is the difference between these?
Difference.
Do we all
Yeah.
use the same tropes, or are there specific tropes you can only use? How have you found that
Yeah.
in your research?
Yeah. Well, the first book was just kind of me kind of figuring out in general the whole thing. And each book is different because I've kind of learned different things along the way. And
Mm,
so in the first book I talk about romance mystery and then I do some sci-fi fantasy in there and mystery slash thriller. So I tried to get like the big genre tropes.
right.
And then people had asked me like, "Oh, you didn't put horror in there." And I was like, I don't really know that much about horror. And so then I was like, but I wonder what that would be like. So then I kind of like
Okay.
fell down that rabbit hole. And but the interesting thing that I learned about horror, which I didn't know, was that that was what really helped me see that tropes are relationships because I just kind of assumed horror is like slasher stuff.
Right, right.
And but there's actually so much more going on in it. It can be that. But even at that level, it's really it doesn't turn out to be a random person. It's a hidden identity slash disguise of someone they know. So, and it was like, oh, well, of course that makes more sense because really what's more terrifying? Like this monster that randomly like attacks you off the street or like this dear deep friend you have who knows all these things about you, who's secretly like terrorizing you and you don't know. Like that's actually
Yeah.
more terrifying.
Yeah.
So that was just really interesting for me to like do a bunch of reading and watch a bunch of things to see, oh, it's the terror is actually of horror is the really those relationships. And then with romance, it was just people were I realized, oh, there's all these subgenres of romance that actually have different like reader expectations. So like we all know, like, oh yeah, definitely a sweet romance is different than like a paranormal, and unless you're just gonna, and you can merge them together. But what are readers looking for in those different ways? And especially if you're going to merge them, you need to know that, because the last thing we want is an unhappy romance reader, because then they always seem so motivated to leave a review.
You must be a romance writer.
They love
This is
your book. They're like, "Oh, I love your book." And if they hate your book, they're like, "Oh, they're getting a review,"
it's a terrible book. Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, and usually it's interesting when you read the reviews. I mean, some of them are just
Yeah.
silly, like,
Right.
the spine is broken. It's like, well, that's not my fault, you know?
Yeah.
But some of
Right.
them is the expectations. And so
Right.
when you're using the trope thesaurus, what what also caught my attention last week when Russell was interviewing you is like using it in the book blurb. And I
Mhm.
think the book blurb can really, everyone hates them to
Yes.
write them.
Right.
This can help you. And it can also help you avoid writing the wrong trope
Mhm.
into the book blurb, right?
Mhm.
So you went on about how you love twins, and
Right.
twin stories. So maybe you wrote a book about twins, but maybe you didn't switch their identities. Maybe you
Right.
use no like real
Yeah.
tropes. They just happen to be twins,
Right.
which Monica was like, why would you do this? But
Right.
hey, it
Right.
happens. Sometimes we
Right. Yes.
don't really talk too much
Highlight that.
about that then, right?
Right, right. Then just make them, then there's like siblings. But
Right,
yeah,
right.
because when I hear twin, I'm always like, yeah, there better be some identity swapping like we talked about in that interview, or mistaken identity. I mean, like that's the whole purpose. Otherwise, why bother, you know?
Why be identical?
Yeah, exactly. So, yeah, so I think, and there are lots of people, and like we had talked about this before, there's some really good examples of how people are using tropes in their blurbs. And I think it can help writers, because it's such a different business, the blurb writing from the book writing. And
Mm,
so it can kind of help you like focus a little bit on what do I need to communicate, as opposed to telling us like all the things, because then like the reader's eyes glaze over, and we're just kind of like, that's really what tropes are for, is to like hook a reader, and then like make them want to know more. And that's the same purpose of a blurb. So to kind
okay.
of use them, and that's why they do work well together in that way.
Okay. And
So,
you even mentioned that there are some authors writing different blurbs depending on which readers they want to hook, which I hadn't heard of
oh,
before.
I thought that was either Russell or Monica who said that. But,
Somebody said it, but
yeah,
that's an
somebody said it,
interesting
but
idea,
that
isn't it?
is really interesting, and it kind of makes sense, but I hadn't thought about that before. But if you have a book that's like, say, if you did like write a sweet paranormal, like cozy, then yeah, you could do some different one that emphasizes the mystery more, one that emphasizes, the slow relationship development, or the kind of community aspect of it. And so, and one obviously that's going to talk about the paranormal element. So I was like, oh yeah, that is interesting.
Yeah, it somehow when you break it down to the tropes that you want the reader to see, at least for me, I was like, oh, that just sounds easier. I'm just gonna say
Yeah.
it like that. And it's interesting because I had just put a blurb up to see
Mhm.
if it would catch, and it was catching very little. So I was like, clearly this blurb is not good.
Right.
So it's like, okay, back to the drawing board. But then I saw you talk, and I was like, ooh, I know what I have what I have to pull out of this.
Yeah. Because it
Um,
is like little like red flags, but in a good way for
mhm.
readers. Because they're like, oh, you know, like I can relate to that. There's something and we just have so many competing things for our attention, that anything we can do to kind of get somebody to slow down and take a closer look is great.
Right, right. So when you're breaking down these storylines in these books, I think
Mhm.
you do a ton in the romance. I haven't gotten the horror,
Mhm.
which I might do, even though I don't read or write it. But hey, who
Mhm.
cares? You could always learn something. There's
Mhm.
a lot of tropes, like they're all
Yes,
highlighted
I
here, right?
know. Yes. Yeah. It was
So
it was a
do you think
surprise to me
writers
when I
understand all of these?
well, I think the important thing to realize is they're used to different degrees.
Okay.
Like, so it's not like so you might use a little bit of like the age gap when it's really an enemies to lovers story, but oh,
Mhm.
they do also happen to have an age, so but I do think the great thing about showing that all those are in there is that they're all ways that you can generate conflict without
Okay.
having to have like, explosion, 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 especially if you're doing like romance or something like contemporary romance or like romantic comedy or things that you don't have a lot of action, then you really need to like, how are you going to have all this interpersonal conflict? Like, what are ways that you're going to be able to do that?
Okay. So
So
then
that's what,
how do you do that? How do you see that
yeah.
with the
So
tropes?
so how I would use it with the tropes is like taking and using little bits of them in different places. So like say is there any like book or well, it's hard to use books because we all read so many different things, but is there like a particular um like romance movie you like or something? Was
Oh
this
gosh, now you put me on the spot. Well, I just watched
That's
In Her
okay.
Shoes. Have you ever watched that? It's a
I haven't.
2005. You haven't?
Sorry.
Mm.
Sorry.
So it's like it's siblings,
Okay.
sisters, right?
Yeah. Oh,
It's the
good.
ugly duckling. I
Yes.
analyzed it as I
Yeah.
was
That's
watching.
great.
So there's let's think of a romance. What about Love Actually? Have you seen that? That's a
Yes. I don't tend to think of it as a romance um just
What's a
because
simple romance?
but it's yeah, it has some I mean, because it doesn't like some of it ends satisfyingly and some of it
Some of it
doesn't.
doesn't. That's true. So
Yeah. But
let's put a pin for a second. In
yeah,
something like that with a huge character
yeah,
cast,
yes.
does each one follow a main trope, do you think? Have you
Well,
seen that?
I think there's a bunch of different interesting tropes in there. So like the one that sticks with me the most of that is the one with Emma Thompson and Alan
Yes.
Rickman and the love triangle
Triangle. Yeah.
with his I guess she was office assistant or something. And I guess that's why I don't think of it as a romance because,
Right.
like,
That's
oh my
kind of
God.
left in the air.
Yeah, like he's such a dick.
Yes, he is, especially when he's buying the present for the
Yes,
office worker when you really feel like, oh, he's going to be nice to his wife.
right,
Who
right,
does that to Emma Thompson? I mean,
right. Which is but that is like a great example of a red herring, right? Because when
oh,
we
okay.
see that scene, we think, oh, he's doing this, we're like, yay, they're gonna pull it out, it's gonna be okay. And then yeah, when she opens that and it's just, it's not that because that was when he gives her like the Joni Mitchell tapes or something like that instead. And so she knows that it's gone elsewhere. So I think that's a great example of like how a romance uses that red herring slash misdirection trope because
Right,
it
right,
creates
right.
some tension without it being like, like oh some explosion or something or big
Yeah,
kidnapping
that is true,
sounds.
though. That's true.
Yeah,
So you
but
have love triangle there, and then you have the red herring there, and then yeah.
yeah, and then that one is kind of and the red herring, and then I was just thinking about that one is kind of like there's the that second chance it seems like there's
Hmm.
going to
True.
be a second chance reunion and they kind of and stay together in the end, but doesn't he like come back from a trip and she like turns her cheek for him and he kisses like it's very
Yeah,
kind of you get this impression that it's like okay it's not what it could have
it might
been.
not work 'cause
Yeah,
it could go either way,
right,
right?
right,
Kind of
exactly.
like the audience can choose, I guess.
Right,
Um,
right.
well,
But
that's
those are
what.
but those are like I didn't mean to cut you off.
No, go ahead.
I was just thinking of like those are ways that little bits of tropes are used in that storyline because it's
Mhm.
like it's not like his whole the whole storyline between those that married couple is about red herrings, but it's just kind of like an interesting little way that they used it in there. So if you read it and you see that you'd be like, oh, there's a red herring in there. It's not like it's a a big mystery like the Agatha Christie ones that are all over the place now or things like that which are like literally made of those that are
Right.
created with all those in place, but it's just like little ways to keep the conflict going. And so that was just kind of one of them that I was thinking the storyline in that. And then the one with Colin Firth and the woman cheating on Colin Firth with his brother,
I
right?
don't remember. Is that in Love Actually?
Is that the one where doesn't he have a girlfriend and she says, oh, she's sick. So he goes to a wedding or he goes to a
Yeah,
funeral.
that's true. Oh my God.
Yeah.
What a
And
terrible, it's like such a sad Christmas movie.
I
that
know
we
that's why I'm
watched.
not a huge fan of it as like I don't really think of it as a romance because like but it has, I would say there's kind of it's definitely love story and there's some, romantic elements in it, but it's not like a thing you'd put on Hallmark
Right.
anymore.
Well, going with Colin Firth, what about
Yeah.
Bridget Jones? That's a retelling of Pride and
Oh
Prejudice,
yeah,
right?
I
So,
love that one. Yes. Yes, tons of cool there's tons of cool tropes in that. Well, first of all, they do a really good job of setting up the kind of enemies thing because, he like with Pride and Prejudice, he insults her like right
yeah.
off. At the if we're talking about Bridget Jones at their Christmas thing with the families. And then there's definitely across the tracks because they're even though the parents are friends, they kind of show that they're from different he's very learned and Bridget is not.
Yes.
Just kind of lets it all hang out. I think there's definitely obviously that love triangle element with her and Hugh Grant.
Hugh Grant.
Daniel Cleaver. I love the last name Cleaver for him is so great too because he's just so, such a bad boy. And which is another trope and he's also like her boss
Right.
and
Right.
he's totally the alpha of
Yes.
that kind of thing because he's just I hadn't even realized when it came out a long time ago. I was talking about it with a babysitter who'd come to watch. So my husband she and I were talking about it and she said I love that scene where he's getting off the elevator and he's looking from side to side and I was like, oh, I hadn't even thought about that, but it was like such an interesting thing of like picked up on it of like he's kind of getting off and he's like this like kind of like searching for prey.
Yeah.
And I was like, oh, yeah. And that's basically kind of relates back to that whole alpha hole trope,
Right.
just
Right.
he's got, several women going at one time. And so him and Bridget and then that there's just a lot of great tropes that they pack in. Like, so he and Darcy have a history together. As we know, they were former friends, and then he slept with his wife. And then, they have this rivalry that's reinstated with when they both are interested in Bridget. And I think it was interesting that she and the mother says early on, oh, when her mother's telling her about Darcy, she says, well, you live right around the corner from each other. And it was
Yeah.
like, oh, so they're like establishing like forced proximity, kind of like, because, so there's a lot of like little ways that tropes are embedded in there without it being the enemies to lovers one is like the big
Okay.
one, but
Okay.
there's lots of little ones that are filtered in through the whole thing.
Okay.
Um, I think, which is based on Pride and Prejudice, which is, of course, packed with the same kind of awesome tropes, which is why it's so popular.
Timeless.
Yeah,
Like
it
that's how.
it is. So, so many years later. But that's kind of like I didn't want people to be like overwhelmed, but I want them to see like, oh, there are so many different things you can do with tropes and you can use them a little bit or a lot. You don't have
Mhm.
to like everything doesn't have to be the same
Right.
level of a trope.
Right. Right.
Just
So how have you used them? How has it
Mhm.
changed since you've studied these? How has it
Mhm.
changed your writing or how you help writers
Yeah.
plot out their story?
Yeah. I definitely it helps me think about what are the connections between the characters and how can we make them like even more so.
Okay.
One of the I don't know if you have it on your craft shelf, but one of the things I really liked was Donald Moss has a book about writing the breakout novel.
Hmm.
And in there he had a really cool exercise, which I didn't really understand till I was working on this trope book. And then it made more sense where he was saying, like, you have all your characters in your book and they're doing different things, but think of ways that you can combine those characters. So instead of having like three best friends, she could just have two best friends because not all the things they need to do need to be different people. And when you
Hmm.
concentrate them down like that, it gives it more conflict and storytelling power. And that
Okay.
was what helped me figure like, oh yeah, that's what tropes are doing. They're like tightening the connections between the characters. And so that's really helped me a lot because like when I'm looking at something and I'll be like, okay, yeah, that's interesting, but how can I make it more, you know?
Okay, so when you say it's tightening, do you mean like because we understand them intuitively, we don't have to do as much
Um,
backstory?
it's like kind of let's see, if we talk about if we go back to like Bridget Jones' Diary,
Hmm.
maybe we could think about how like, okay, so she likes she has this crush on Daniel Cleaver, but he's also her boss. And so
Hmm.
against her better judgment and because she doesn't care and because he's so, incredibly attractive, she gets in a relationship with him. And then that doesn't end well. And so when she's interviewing, at one point she says, I need this job. When she decides to tell the truth, she says, well, I really need this job because I've shagged my boss. And the kind of portly man who's like very middle-aged, not looking like Daniel Cleaver behind the desk says, "Well, that's not a problem. We don't have a problem with that here." And but it was kind of like, oh, if it was just, if Daniel Cleaver was just like a guy she met at a bar as
Sure.
opposed to like her boss, and that would make it less fraught with tensions. And then, oh, not only
Mm,
is it a guy who's her boss, but it's like Darcy's former best friend. And, so those kind of things made it more conflict filled.
right. And it makes it a little bit more believable then, because
Right.
we can get manuscripts back where the editor says something like, flesh it out. Or
Yes,
you're like,
exactly. Right.
what does
Right.
that mean? Or add more
Right.
conflict, or like, why do they care about this? And
Right.
like as a new writer, or if you're just
Yeah.
struggling with the story, you're like, I don't know. I just know
Yes.
that
Yes.
I need
And
her to move jobs, you know.
yes, right. And I think I found that tropes are helpful in building the character because I like,
Okay.
although I'll like hear dialogue kind of like in my head when I start to see a character, then it's like you need to know more about them. And so then
Mm,
it's like, well, what is their family situation? Like, what kind of job do they have? And then not even just like what kind of job do they have, but where are they in that? Are they like experienced? Are they inexperienced? Are they, going to lose their job? Are they going to get moved? Like when you start to really delve into the details, there are a lot more um, things that we can be mining in the story
okay.
world
Okay.
just off that basic idea of like everybody, it's very common for like cozy mysteries, or even in romance for a while. I don't know, I don't see it as much now, but for a while, everybody was inheriting a bakery, you
Yes,
know?
that's so true.
And you just be like, some stories did that better than others in terms of
Hmm.
some of them just used it as like a set piece of the location. But then some would be like, oh, well, they inherited this bakery, but it's next door to like a rival bakery who happens to be owned by this super hunky guy. And, who they've maybe she had a relationship with in high school and they had a misunderstanding, like, so there's all these different
Right.
ways that you can like keep kind of tying it back or like tying, I guess I kind of think about it like almost like looping around and tightening a circle.
Yes. Yes. Like bringing that seam together.
Yeah,
That's
yeah, right, right, right.
see, that's really interesting because I think the way that we think about stories sometimes we can like drive our heads will explode.
Yes,
Like
yes,
I have these characters and I know that I want conflict. I like
right,
because in the end that's a story. Like I
right, right.
argued with a writer the other day, which you shouldn't have. I was like, no, you really do need conflict. And she's like, no, you don't. Like okay, whatever. But that's
I
why we
have to say
read.
I agree. If you don't have conflict, it's just, I mean, it doesn't have to be explosion conflict like we
Right.
talked about, but you do have to have conflict. Otherwise, it's like a speech.
Yes, it's not it's it's probably the reason why we put down certain books. We
Hmm.
say like why. So my
Right.
mother read a book. She loves to call me and tell me the books that she's like, "Ugh,"
Yeah.
you know.
My mom does the same thing.
Does she- They're the only ones that we can talk. They're like, why would the author do this? And a lot that she's frustrated with, I think, is like what you just said. They will use a bakery, or
Mhm.
anything, World War II as a setting.
Yes.
Like World War II is huge in the last 2 years, but there were
Right.
some who use it as a setting, and
Hmm.
then some who used it as like to create that whole conflict and bringing in all the different
Hmm.
tropes. And
Yes.
I think that's when people say layer your story, and you're like, what does that mean?
Yeah, right. Right. Yes, I agree. That's true. Because I feel that way about World War II stuff because my mother does love those too, and I was like, I can't read, like, I just don't I don't feel like there's, for me, anything else that can be said about that that's interesting. But clearly there's a whole demographic that loves that. So it's just kind of like, okay, you have to find out what that is and different ways. And it can be like there's I think one way that it's done that when we talk about twisting a trope is like it seemed like there was a lot more female spy stories for World War II that I was hearing
Right,
about. And I was like,
right.
"Oh, so that's kind of a way to make it more interesting. It doesn't have to just be men who are spies. We can have women who are spies." So
Yes.
that's a way to make it more interesting. But yeah, I think another way to layer the characters because I always struggle with like people be like, "Oh, well, what's in the refrigerator?" And that like never helps me.
Yeah.
Like with my characters or what kind of clothes they're wearing. I need to know like who they are more as people before I can see those like external things.
Yes. Yes. And I think we could go back to Bridget Jones' Diary. Like there's a
Right.
ton of ways to write a story, right? So
Mhm.
they the writer could have used even more conflict with their friends. So like with Devil Wears
Yes.
Prada, there's that scene where she's with her friends and they all reject her. So there's, you're adding even more conflict to her
Mhm.
most stressful situation. Like
Mhm.
so stressed out she's not eating anymore.
Right.
And then on top of that is like her friends are like peace out, we're done.
Yeah.
So like if the friends weren't there, if
Mhm.
they hadn't established that relationship in the beginning, you wouldn't have
Mhm.
that. Or if you're stuck, in the middle as we
Mhm.
tend to go, like
Yes.
how can you add an even more miserable layer to
Right.
your
Right.
character for them to finally wake up, right? And
Right.
decide that there are certain things that need to be done. Like,
Right.
and I think the weird thing about our world is some of it writing can be very intuitive, it
Mhm.
can be learned, but
Mhm.
like all of these writing books miss on something. You know what
Mhm.
I mean? Like
Right.
so
Oh, yeah.
so as you said with the some people say open the refrigerator, it's like I don't know what that means. So next
Yeah.
next
Yeah.
book.
And some people always do, that, oh, that's really helpful for them. But it's like for a long time I would like try that and it just didn't help me and I would get like super frustrated.
Right.
And I was like, but then it would help me more if I could kind of think of like one thing I like about tropes is like that obviously I like secrets. So like I think it's true that like if every character, every significant character can have a secret. And that
Mhm.
really helped me like, oh, like what do they not want to get out about them or an experience they had? Or it doesn't have to be depending on your genre, it doesn't even have to be a really like deep, dark thing, but it could just be something that's embarrassing or that they would rather forget or something like that. But the act of them protecting that like, gives so much more, like, me an idea of who that character is and, like, potential story conflict that I was like, "Oh, that's why I heard people say that, but I didn't get why it
Right.
was as useful as it is."
Yeah, yeah. And that's kind of what I feel like with your book. So I'm excited that we could talk today because I know people talk about tropes, especially on TikTok, and
Mhm,
especially in the romance. But I do think there's a very short list of tropes out on social media
mhm,
of, because there might be the most like viewed maybe
right,
or the
yeah,
ones that maybe
sure,
have become cliched because they've been written
mhm,
incorrectly too many times, but
mhm,
your list is huge.
mhm.
Your list is very, very long, and so it really helps me be like, okay, there's
Yeah,
I can.
because it does seem like in romance, like, we always hear about, like, enemies to lovers is, like, we
Mhm,
always hear about that one, or
right,
friends to lovers, or forbidden love,
or
and those are
best
really
friend's brother, I think
yeah,
is
yeah, and those are really important, but there's also, like, so many others.
yeah,
It's not just those. So just to
yes.
kind of
Yeah,
help.
that's like the main one, right? Like, but that will only get you so far because I feel like that's the easy part. Almost like when you see the scene or you see the dialogue, you hear it and
Mhm,
you see the character and kind of how they are. But as you've been saying, you have to dig in and find those different layers. So like enemies to lovers, okay, but
mhm,
making him your boss,
mhm,
and then having the other guy come in and the love triangle, that's what really starts building out that
Mhm.
story, right? More than
Right.
just like, oh, they hate each other. Well, then
Right.
how are they going to get to love each other?
Right. And that was kind of like one thing that I've been experimenting with is like how you take a trope and like actually show it through show it through a story. So I was like experimenting with these like 5 steps to do that. So if we thought about if we talk more about or go back to like Bridget Jones' Diary, it's like so okay with enemies to lovers, we know it we see that they right away we see that in that first
Mm,
scene with them. So it's like told telling us as viewers and readers or whatever, here it is. This is going to be in here somewhere. Be aware of it. And so like, okay, I like that. So I set up a little bit. And then we see how she develops it. Like so that was what I kind of call like I'm trying to remember what I actually termed it now since I that was like showing what it is. And then the second stage I think of as like showtime. Which is like where you're going to see in multiple scenes through the book of how that is. And so we
okay.
see different ways that her irritation with him just keeps increasing. And that, you know, he thinks she's stupid and all this kind of like it's just kind of building. And then there's that scene where it's such a great scene where she goes to her friend's house for dinner and I think she's just broken up with Cleaver or he doesn't or something and she's the only one who's there not in a couple and they go around the table and they're all sitting down and they all introduce each other. They all are introduced and it's just like nauseating because they're just so like everybody's so
So
self-satisfied.
horrible.
Yeah, they're like, hello, hello, and just and then they say, so somebody asks her, oh, well, how come there's so, why are there so many single women? And then she says the thing about like, oh, it's because I think because we have scales under our clothing, which is like such a great comment. But as she leaves and she's all frustrated, he comes down the stairs and she's like, "Ugh, like I don't want to hear about it. I've I think that was when she had her infamous first scene where
Yeah.
the camera went up her butt kind of or when she saw her stockings and her fanny on TV
Yeah.
and she says, I've been quite humiliated enough today and he says, well, I like you just the way you are.
Right. Yeah.
And then
Yeah.
it's like a turning point because she's like, this, and they're about to have a moment, and his current girlfriend comes and
Right.
calls him back. And so then you're like, oh, okay. So you're kind of hoping things would, you're obviously hoping things would change between them. And you start to see, but then it's like, oh, this very present, very determined other woman is with him. And so then you just kind of that's like a turning point, and then you just see how she starts to rethink things with him and then she makes that horrible speech at his parents' Ruby wedding anniversary. And when the woman makes it seem like they're going to get married. And then you're like, oh, all is lost because
Yeah.
now she realized that she likes him and she realized he did like her at one point, but now it took her so long to figure that out. And then of course, then there's the end. So it's like, I feel like it's kind of a way to see how that trope was played out as opposed to just say enemies to lovers, but then how do you actually move it along?
Right. Right.
So it was kind of like these five kind of steps, which I haven't
Yeah.
explained particularly, but
Well, I also like your idea for a secret too, because a secret I would say for Bridget Jones would be like she really doesn't want to be seen as the less educated
right,
girl from the other side of the tracks, which is like a trope, but like
right.
that's kind of what she's guarding, like
Mhm,
because she changes for
mhm,
Cleaver.
mhm.
Like he gets to
Yes,
mold her how, and then when
yes.
he says, I like you just so being able to like see what she's guarding and then the tropes and then saying, well, clearly now I need a scene in which he hints at the fact that she is perfect the way she is.
Hmm.
Now, how do I move that and where does it go? I mean, that's up to you, dear writer. You have to figure that one out,
Right,
which is
right.
fun, right? We got to go back to making this fun.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. So there's different and you get to make those like little kind of choices and we get it's not like it's a shock to us when he says that because before that we see this scene where when she's with Cleaver at the Tarts and Vickers party and
Yes.
remember they're in the boats and he's kind of rowing the very serious girlfriend and she's talking about some legal thing and he looks over at Bridget longingly who's like laughing and there's splashing Cleaver and just that expression on his face, you're like, oh, he really does like her.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
And putting those hints in there. So
yeah,
I love it. I'm gonna have to go watch that movie again.
yeah, it's so good. And I just felt, like, so disappointed in the second movie because I felt like it didn't bring anything new to the table, it just
Mm.
kinda tried to retread what was so well done the first time that I
Which we can avoid if we get your trope book and we make sure that we choose a different trope.
yeah, because it just kind of did all like, even the same there were a lot of just even the same scenes, like the fight scene, which was so well done in the first one of those 2 guys, that was just such a great kind of, "Oh, he is kind of an alpha male," and, "Oh," like, "Oh,"
Right,
this all
right.
but and then when they did in the second one, I was like, "Really?"
Yeah, see, laziness is on both sides.
I know.
Writers,
Yes.
movies.
Yes.
They think it's gonna be easy
Everywhere.
money, right?
Yes.
And then
Right.
you want
Yes.
you want people to read through your series, writers. So you want
Right.
to make sure that you get a new trope, right? For at least a new main one. We
Yeah.
are definitely going to use the same ones over and over. But it's interesting because before we go, like I am working out a series. I'm trying to specifically know what is going to happen in each book. And it's
Uh-huh.
funny because I think, it's like when you name a character a certain name, your brain keeps thinking of that name and it just appears everywhere in your writing.
Yes,
You're like,
yes.
why is everyone named David? Like,
Right.
stop it.
Yes.
Choose other names.
Yeah.
It was the same trope I was like, I've already done that one. I need you to move out of my way. I
Yeah.
need you to
Yeah.
go this way. Okay, now I can go to your book and just say like, okay, how about I try that one?
Yeah.
Okay, I can think it through before I start writing. Like, okay, maybe it won't will work, maybe it won't.
And you can combine them in different in combining them in different ways. It doesn't have
Yes.
to be you can still use, like, the main tropes, but just combining them in different ways gives you really different stories.
Yes, exactly. I love that. So you have the trope thesaurus, the romance,
Mhm.
and then the horror, and now the sci-fi and fantasy is coming out.
Yes.
Do you have any thoughts on bringing out other genres?
Yes, I've been asked about doing a mystery thriller one, and
Oh,
that'll be next year.
okay.
So, yeah.
Interesting. All right, so we will keep an eye on those. Thank you
Okay.
so much, Jennifer Hill, for coming and talking to us about tropes. I
Well,
hope
thanks
that
for
this
having me.
helped people not shy away from them anymore, right?
I hope so. Yeah, I don't want people to be afraid of them or like, "Oh, it's too" you're already using them, just make them work for you because
Mm.
we always can use more things that can help us tell better stories.
Yes, as they talk about our writer's toolbox, this anything to
Yes.
make it easier, right?
Yes,
They like,
exactly.
okay. I
Yes.
love it. Thank you so much.
Oh, sure. Thank you.